You think you know how the dark underworld operates. The boss always falls for the supermodel, the slender assassin, the flawless beauty. But what happens when the most lethal man in the city corners a size 22 accountant who has seen too much? She shoved her heavy frame against the brick, terrified, screaming, "I'm not your type! I'm too big for your twisted games!" He didn't laugh. He just stepped into her space, his eyes dark with obsession, and whispered, "Try me." The rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the 24th floor of Apex Holdings. Maeve Henderson rubbed her temples, adjusting the blue light glasses perched on her nose. At 11:45 p.m. on a Friday, the sprawling open-plan office was a graveyard of empty cubicles, humming servers, and stale air conditioning. Maeve was used to being the last one left. It was the story of her life. The invisible workhorse. At a solid size 22, with soft, generous curves that she constantly tried to hide beneath oversized, drab cardigans, Maeve had learned that blending into the background was the safest survival strategy. Society had taught her early on that taking up physical space meant she had to shrink her personality to compensate. She didn't go to the after-work drinks. She didn't flirt with the handsome analysts in the break room. She just did the math. Numbers were safe. Numbers made sense. Until tonight, her finger hovered over the trackpad as she stared at the master ledger for the company's offshore accounts. Apex Holdings was supposedly a high-end logistics and shipping conglomerate. But for the last 3 hours, Maeve had been tracing a ghost. A discrepancy of exactly $4.6 million had vanished from the quarterly shipping manifests. It hadn't been misplaced. It had been surgically extracted, masked by a complex web of dummy invoices routed through shell corporations in the Cayman Islands. The authorization signature on the dummy invoices belonged to her branch manager, David Trent. "Oh, David, you absolute idiot," Maeve whispered to the empty room, her heart beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knew rumors about Apex Holdings. Everyone did. You didn't work for a company that dominated the eastern seaboard's shipping lanes without hearing the whispers about the Mercer family. They were old money, dark money, the kind of people who didn't fire employees for embezzlement. They erased them. Maeve hurriedly began compiling the data onto an encrypted flash drive. She needed leverage, or at least proof that she had nothing to do with it. Her thick thighs chafed uncomfortably against the rigid fabric of her slacks as she shifted in her ergonomic chair. A chair that was always just a little too tight for her hips. Ding! The soft chime of the private executive elevator, echoing through the silent floor, made her freeze. That elevator was locked after 8 p.m. Heavy, synchronized footsteps stepped onto the plush carpet. It wasn't the shuffling, nervous walk of David Trent. It was the sound of predators. Maeve instinctively ducked, her heart rocketing into her throat. She scrambled under her large mahogany desk, her heavy breaths sounding deafening in her own ears. She pulled her knees to her chest, her soft stomach pressing tightly against her thighs, praying the shadows would conceal her. "Trent swore the office was empty," a voice rasped. It was a cold, gravelly sound that sent ice water through Maeve's veins. "Trent is a liar," a second voice replied. This voice was different. It was smooth, rich, and terrifyingly calm. It resonated with absolute authority. "Find him. He's supposed to be clearing his desk in his office. Bring him to the boardroom. Don't kill him yet." "Yes, Mr. Mercer." Maeve clamped a hand over her mouth. Mercer. Cassius Mercer, the head of the syndicate. A man whose name was only spoken in hushed, terrified tones in the break room. He was a ghost, a myth of violence and immaculate tailoring. and he was standing 20 feet away from her desk. She heard the sound of doors being kicked open down the hall. A few moments later, the muffled, pathetic sounds of a man weeping echoed through the corridor. "Please, Cassius, please, I can explain. It was a routing error." David Trent's voice was high-pitched, hysterical. "A routing error?" Cassius mused, the footsteps moving closer to the center of the office floor. $4.6 million accidentally routed itself into a private account in Zurich, David. I was going to put it back. I was just borrowing it. Thwack! The sound of flesh hitting bone was sickeningly loud. David whimpered. Maeve squeezed her eyes shut, tears of pure terror pricking her eyes. She was going to die here. She was 28, severely overweight, perpetually single, and she was going to die under a desk clutching a pink novelty flash drive. Suddenly, the heavy footsteps stopped, right in front of her cubicle. "Elias," Cassius's smooth voice cut through the silence. "The main terminal is still on." Maeve stopped breathing. A pair of polished, custom-made Italian leather shoes came into view beneath the rim of her desk. Then, slowly, a man crouched down. Maeve found herself staring into the most terrifying, mesmerizing face she had ever seen. Cassius Mercer was a man carved from marble and violence. He had sharp, aristocratic cheekbones, a strong jaw dusted with dark stubble, and eyes the color of a stormy ocean, a piercing, icy gray. A thin, faded scar cut through his left eyebrow, a quiet testament to a brutal past. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit that fit his broad, muscular frame with lethal perfection. He didn't look surprised to see a plus-size woman cowering under the desk. His gaze just swept over her, taking in her trembling frame, her wide, terrified brown eyes, and the flash drive clutched to her chest. "Well," Cassius said softly, his voice a dark, velvet purr. "What do we have here?" Cassius didn't reach for a weapon. He simply extended a large, impeccably manicured hand, palm up. A heavy gold signet ring glinted on his index finger. "Come out, little mouse," he commanded. Maeve's legs were shaking so violently she could barely support her own weight. She awkwardly crawled out from under the desk, acutely aware of how clumsy and large she must look. She scrambled to her feet, instinctively wrapping her arms around her heavy torso, trying to make herself smaller. Cassius stood up, towering over her. He was easily 6'4", exuding a raw, predatory energy that sucked the oxygen from the room. His right-hand man, Elias Croft, a lean, scarred man holding a silenced pistol, stepped forward, raising the weapon toward Maeve. "Wait," Cassius murmured, raising 2 fingers. Elias instantly lowered the gun. David Trent, bleeding from his nose and kneeling on the carpet a few yards away, suddenly shrieked. "Her! It was her! Maeve Henderson! She's the senior accountant! She cooked the books, Cassius! I caught her trying to cover it up tonight!" Maeve's terror instantly transmuted into a blazing, white-hot fury. The absolute audacity of this mediocre, slimy man trying to pin his theft on her snapped the tether of her fear. "You lying, pathetic worm!" Maeve yelled, her voice echoing in the large space. Both Cassius and Elias looked slightly taken aback by the sheer volume erupting from the trembling woman. Maeve turned her blazing eyes to Cassius, pointing a plump, shaking finger at Trent. "He authorized 14 dummy invoices through shell companies in the Cayman Islands over the last 3 months. The money was transferred to Zurich using his personal biometric signature. I have the exact timestamps, the routing numbers, and the decrypted ledger right here on this drive." She shoved the pink, rhinestone-studded flash drive toward Cassius's chest. Cassius looked at the ridiculous piece of plastic, then back up to Maeve's flushed, furious face. A slow, dark smirk ghosted across his lips. It was a look of pure, dangerous intrigue. He took the drive, tossing it to Elias without breaking eye contact with Maeve. "Is she telling the truth, David?" "No, she's a lying—" Cassius didn't even turn his head. He just gave a slight nod. Elias raised the pistol and pulled the trigger. A dull foot sounded, and David Trent collapsed sideways onto the carpet, a neat red hole in his forehead. Maeve screamed, stumbling backward. Her heel caught on the edge of her plastic chair mat, and she fell hard, her back slamming against the frosted glass wall of the conference room. She was hyperventilating, the metallic smell of blood and cordite filling the air. Cassius stepped over David's body, his eyes fixed entirely on Maeve. He closed the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps of a stalking panther. Maeve pressed herself flat against the glass, her heart threatening to burst. "Please!" she sobbed, tears spilling over her flushed cheeks. "I don't know anything else. I didn't see anything. I'm nobody. Just let me go." Cassius stopped mere inches from her. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating off his body, smell the intoxicating scent of bergamot, expensive tobacco, and gunpowder. He placed a large hand on the glass wall, right beside her head, effectively caging her in. His icy grey eyes dropped down, taking in her full heaving breasts beneath her sensible blouse, the curve of her wide hips, the soft, thick expanse of her thighs. It wasn't the look of disgust or dismissal she was used to receiving from handsome, wealthy men. It was a look of heavy, possessive hunger. "You're not nobody, Maeve," he said, testing the syllables of her name on his tongue like a fine wine. "You're the woman who just cracked a laundering scheme my best forensic accountants missed for 3 months. And you did it on a Friday night." I just like numbers," she stammered, entirely thrown off by the intense, burning way he was looking at her. She felt exposed, vulnerable. She hated her body in that moment, hated that she was soft and heavy, while he was all hard angles and lethal muscle. "Don't play with me," he murmured, leaning closer. Maeve's insecurities flared, acting as a bizarre shield against her fear. She pushed against his solid chest, though it was like trying to move a boulder. "Stop it. I know how men like you operate. I'm not some fragile, delicate little doll you can toy with before you kill me. I'm fat. I'm a mess. I'm too big for you to play your twisted psychological games with. If you're going to shoot me, just do it." Cassius's eyes darkened to the color of storm clouds. He didn't step back. Instead, he moved a fraction of an inch closer, his hard thighs brushing against her soft ones. The contact sent a shocking electric jolt straight to Maeve's core. He lowered his head, his lips hovering a breath away from her ear. "Too big?" he whispered, his voice a dark, vibrating threat that made her knees weak. "Try me." He pulled back just enough to look into her wide, shocked eyes. "You don't get to die tonight, Maeve Henderson. And you don't get to go home either. You work for me now. You're going to find out exactly where my money went, and who helped David Trent take it." He stepped back, adjusting his cuffs with terrifying nonchalance. "Elias, get a clean-up crew for Trent, and bring the car around. Miss Henderson is coming with us." The Mercer compound was located 40 miles outside of Chicago, hidden behind wrought-iron gates and acres of dense, private forest. It was a sprawling, modern fortress of glass, steel, and dark stone, overlooking a private lake. For 3 days, Maeve had been a prisoner in a golden cage. Her quarters were larger than her entire apartment. A massive king-sized bed with Egyptian cotton sheets, a marble bathroom with a sunken tub, and a closet that had been hastily, yet accurately, stocked with high-end, plus-size clothing. Someone had clearly taken her measurements while she slept. a thought that made her both deeply unsettled and bizarrely flustered. The clothes weren't the drab, oversized sacks she usually bought. They were tailored silk blouses, cashmere sweaters, and perfectly fitted trousers that hugged her wide hips and thick thighs in a way that felt scandalous. Despite the luxury, there were guards outside her door, and her only company was a top-of-the-line laptop and stacks of encrypted financial ledgers provided by Cassius. She was currently sitting in the compound's massive library, a room smelling of old paper and leather, surrounded by towering bookshelves. She had an unlit cigar in her mouth, a nervous habit she'd picked up just to chew on something while her brain worked overtime. The heavy oak doors swung open. Maeve flinched, pulling the cigar from her mouth. It was Elias Croft. He carried a fresh stack of files, his scarred face twisted into a permanent scowl. Elias didn't like her. He didn't trust outsiders, and he especially didn't respect a weeping, overweight accountant who had been pulled from under a desk. He dropped the files onto the mahogany table with a loud thud. "Here," Elias grunted. "The offshore shell company logs from 2024. Boss wants them reconciled by tomorrow morning." "I can't read a year's worth of encrypted logs in 12 hours, Elias," Maeve said, rubbing her tired eyes. "I need at least 48. Elias sneered, leaning over the table. "You'll do it in 12. I don't know what kind of spell you've got over Cassius, but I see you for what you are, a liability. You're slow, you're soft, and you're costing us time." He looked her up and down with blatant disgust. "Tell me, are we just feeding the pig before the slaughter? Because you certainly eat enough of the kitchen's supplies." Maeve felt the familiar sting of tears, the old, heavy shame settling onto her chest. She looked down, her face burning. It was the same bullying she had faced her whole life, just with higher stakes. "Say that again, Elias." The voice came from the doorway, cold as a mortuary slab. Both Maeve and Elias snapped their heads up. Cassius was standing there, having shed his suit jacket, wearing a fitted black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, exposing muscular forearms corded with veins and dark ink. His eyes were fixed on Elias with a murderous intensity. Elias paled, instantly standing up straight. "Boss, I was just motivating her." Cassius walked slowly into the room. Every step felt deliberate, a countdown to violence. He stopped next to Maeve's chair, placing one large, warm hand protectively on her shoulder. The heat of his touch seeped through her silk blouse, sending a shiver down her spine. "You insulted her," Cassius said softly. "She's an outsider." Cassius moved faster than Maeve's eyes could track. His hand shot out, wrapping around Elias's throat, lifting the grown man entirely off his feet and slamming him against the nearest bookshelf. Heavy leather-bound volumes rained down around them. Maeve gasped, pressing her hands over her mouth. Elias clawed at Cassius's unyielding grip, his face turning a dark, bruised purple as he choked for air. "Maeve is under my protection," Cassius hissed, his face inches from Elias's. The primal, terrifying beast that ruled the underworld was fully unleashed in his eyes. "She has a sharper mind in her sleep than you have on your best day, and her body—" Cassius's gaze flickered to Maeve for a fraction of a second, raw heat radiating from him. "Is perfection. If you ever look at her with disrespect again, if you ever utter a single word about her size, I will cut your tongue out and make you swallow it. Nod, if you understand." Elias, eyes bulging, managed a frantic, desperate nod. Cassius dropped him. Elias collapsed to the floor, gasping and hacking violently. "Get out," Cassius commanded. Elias scrambled up and practically ran from the library, leaving a heavy, stunned silence in his wake. Maeve sat frozen in her chair, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. No one, No one had ever defended her like that. The men in her life had always made her feel like a burden, an embarrassment to be hidden away. But Cassius Mercer, a ruthless killer, had just violently defended her honor. And he had called her body perfect. Cassius turned to her, the murderous aura slowly bleeding out of him, replaced by a quiet, intense focus. He reached out, his knuckles gently brushing against her flushed cheek. "Are you all right, Maeve?" he asked, his voice rough. You didn't have to do that," she whispered, leaning into his touch entirely against her better judgment. "I protect what's mine," he stated simply, as if it were a universal law of physics. He looked down at the sprawling mess of paperwork on her desk. "Have you found anything?" Maeve blinked, trying to force her brain back to the numbers, away from the intoxicating scent of him and the dangerous flutter in her stomach. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking slightly. She pulled a specific ledger forward. David Trent wasn't just stealing the money to get rich. He was paying a debt. The routing numbers for the final Zurich destination, they don't belong to a private account. Cassius leaned over her shoulder, his chest pressing warmly against her back. "Who do they belong to?" Maeve traced her pen over the printed data. "I cross-referenced the holding company. It traces back to a shadow corporation registered in St. Petersburg. The primary shareholder is Anton Ivanov." The air in the room suddenly dropped 10 degrees. Maeve felt Cassius's body go completely rigid against hers. Anton Ivanov, the head of the Volkov syndicate, Cassius's greatest rival, a man who had been trying to usurp the Mercer territory for a decade. "Trent was funding the Volkovs with my money," Cassius murmured, his voice laced with a lethal, icy realization. He looked down at Maeve, his expression a mix of awe and dark purpose. "You just saved my emple, Maeve Henderson, but you've also just made yourself the most valuable target in the city." The revelation of Anton Ivanov's involvement shifted the atmosphere of the Mercer compound from a quiet fortress to an active war room. Over the next 48 hours, Maeve barely slept. The sprawling library became her domain, littered with emptied espresso cups and thousands of pages of decrypted routing logs. She wasn't just hiding anymore. She was hunting. And Cassius was always there, a dark, looming presence, watching her with a mixture of predatory fascination and fierce, unwavering protection. By the third night, the air was thick with tension. Cassius stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out into the pitch-black forest, a glass of amber whiskey in his hand. "We need to move," he announced, his voice slicing through the quiet hum of Maeve's laptop. "Ivanov's men have been probing the outer perimeter. He knows Trent failed, and he knows I have the ledger. He just doesn't know who cracked it yet." Maeve looked up, adjusting her glasses. Her shoulders ached, and her eyes burned. "Where do we go?" "A secure penthouse in the city, registered to a shell corporation, managed by an associate, Fiona Abernathy. It's impenetrable, and we have better tactical advantages there." He set his glass down and walked toward her, his gaze softening as he took in her exhausted posture. "You've done enough, Maeve. Pack whatever you want from the closet. We leave in 20 minutes. The convoy consisted of 3 armored, matte black SUVs. Maeve sat in the back of the middle vehicle, flanked by Cassius on her left and a massive, silent bodyguard on her right. Elias drove the lead car. The rain had returned, slicking the highway in a mirror-like sheen as they sped toward the glittering skyline of Chicago. Maeve clutched her leather tote bag against her stomach, the pink flash drive secured in a hidden pocket. She felt out of place, a soft civilian woman trapped in a metal box with professional killers. Her thick thighs pressed against the luxurious leather seats, and she tried to make herself small, hyper-aware of the space she occupied next to Cassius. He noticed. He always noticed. Cassius shifted closer, the heat of his large frame radiating against her side. He reached out, his long fingers gently prying her white-knuckled grip from her bag. He interlaced his fingers with hers, resting their joined hands on the solid, heavy curve of her thigh. "Stop shrinking, Maeve," he murmured, his voice a low rumble meant only for her ears. "You have nothing to apologize for. Take up all the space you need, especially with me." A flush crept up her neck. "I'm just nervous. I'm an accountant, Cassius. I shouldn't be in an armored motorcade running from the Russian mob." "You are the most brilliant woman I have ever met," he replied, his thumb slowly stroking the soft skin of her hand. "And I swear on my life, Ivanov will never touch you." The promise hung in the air, heavy and absolute. But before Maeve could respond, the world exploded. A deafening crack shattered the night. The SUV violently swerved, the heavy armor groaning as a high-caliber sniper round slammed into the reinforced engine block. The driver cursed, fighting the wheel as the vehicle skidded across the wet asphalt, slamming into the concrete median with bone-jarring force. "Ambush!" The radio crackled with Elias's panicked voice. "We have hostiles on the overpass. Rocket-propelled grenades, boss. Get out of the kill zone." "Down," Cassius roared. He didn't just tell her to get down. He threw his massive, muscular body entirely over hers. Maeve was shoved hard against the floorboards, her cheek pressing into the carpet as Cassius shielded her with his own flesh. His weight was immense, solid, and terrifyingly reassuring. Gunfire erupted outside, a chaotic symphony of automatic weapons tearing through the night. The armored glass of their SUV began to spiderweb under the relentless barrage. "Cassius!" Maeve screamed, her hands desperately gripping his dress shirt. "You're going to get shot!" "I wear Kevlar, little mouse," he grunted, pulling his own weapon from his shoulder holster. "Stay flat." He kicked the heavy armored door open, using it as a shield as he returned fire into the darkness. The noise was blinding. Maeve lay on the floorboards, her heart hammering against her ribs. Fear threatened to paralyze her, but her analytical mind, the mind that processed data in milliseconds, suddenly kicked into overdrive. She looked at the angle of the shattered glass, the trajectory of the sparks flying off the concrete. The heavy gunfire was concentrated on the front and left sides of the convoy. "Cassius!" she yelled over the roar of a detonating grenade. "They're trying to pin us against the median, but the storm drain on the right shoulder. I saw the blueprints for this highway sector during an infrastructure audit last year. There's an access tunnel just 20 yards behind us." Cassius snapped a fresh magazine into his gun, looking down at her wide, terrified, yet brilliantly sharp eyes. A feral, deeply impressed grin broke across his handsome face. "Covering fire!" Cassius bellowed into his comms. "We're moving back to the right." He grabbed Maeve by the waist, hauling her up with staggering strength. "Run, Maeve. Do not stop. I am right behind you." They bolted from the SUV. The night air was thick with the smell of cordite and burning rubber. Maeve ran. She wasn't an athlete. She was heavy, her breath tearing through her lungs like jagged glass, her legs burning with the effort of carrying her weight at such a frantic pace. But she didn't stop. She focused on the concrete barrier ahead, throwing her soft, heavy body over it with a surge of adrenaline, tumbling down the grassy embankment toward the concrete mouth of the storm drain. Cassius landed right beside her, spinning around to fire 3 precise shots into the darkness, before grabbing her arm and pulling her deep into the concrete tunnel. The sounds of the firefight became muffled echoes. They plunged into the darkness, walking for what felt like miles until they reached a secure maintenance substation beneath the city streets. Maeve collapsed against the damp concrete wall, gasping for air, her legs finally giving out. She slid to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees, violently trembling. Cassius holstered his weapon and immediately dropped to his knees in front of her. He pulled a small flashlight from his pocket, illuminating the small enclosed space. His suit was ruined, covered in dust and grease, but his icy grey eyes were completely focused on her. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his hands hurriedly running over her arms, her ribs, the thick curve of her thighs, checking for blood. "No," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "No, I'm okay, I can't breathe." Cassius gently pulled her hands away from her face. He cupped her cheeks, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "Look at me. Breathe with me, Maeve." She looked up into his fierce, beautiful face, forcing her lungs to match the steady, deep rhythm of his chest. "You did perfectly," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him. "Reverence. You saved us, your beautiful, brilliant mind." He lowered his gaze, his eyes tracing the generous curve of her hips, the soft swell of her stomach pressing against her ruined trousers, and the heavy heave of her breasts. The hunger in his eyes was naked, raw, and entirely undeniable. "I thought I was going to lose you," he rasped, his restraint finally snapping. Cassius leaned in, capturing her lips in a bruising, desperate kiss. Maeve gasped, but the sound was swallowed by his mouth. He tasted like adrenaline, mint, and raw, masculine power. He pulled her flush against his hard chest, one hand tangling in her messy hair, the other gripping the thick, soft flesh of her hip, pulling her into his lap. For the first time in her life, Maeve didn't pull away out of shame. She didn't worry that she was too heavy or that her stomach was rolling against his waist. The way he held her, like she was a goddess, like she was the only water in a burning desert, ignited a fire deep in her belly. She kissed him back with equal desperation, her soft hands sliding up his broad shoulders, clinging to him in the dark. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily. Cassius rested his forehead against hers, his eyes dark with obsession. "You are mine," he stated, a vow spoken into the shadows, "and I am going to burn Ivanov's empire to ash for daring to shoot at you." The secure penthouse owned by Fiona Abernathy was a marvel of modern architecture, suspended high above the Chicago skyline. But for the past 3 days, it had functioned as an opulent war room. Maeve had successfully tracked the missing millions from the ledger, but the money had hit a cryptographic wall. The funds had been funneled into a massive, anonymous trust that required biometric authentication, specifically a retinal scan and a voice key to access. "I can't hack it," Maeve admitted, pushing away from her monitors. "But I found a pattern in the proxy server's metadata. The terminal used to initially set up the trust belongs to a private investment firm. The CEO is Garrett Wallace." Cassius, leaning against the edge of the mahogany desk, frowned. "Wallace, he's a society banker. Keeps his hands clean, but he's known to launder for the highest bidder. If he's holding Ivanov's money, he's the key to bringing the Volkovs down." "He's attending the Solstice Gala tonight," Elias chimed in, standing near the door. The right-hand man had been quiet since the ambush, his eyes guarded. "It's an elite neutral ground event. No weapons allowed. High security." "Then we go to the gala," Cassius said. "If we can isolate Wallace, I can extract the voice key and retinal data." "He won't talk to you, Cassius," Maeve pointed out. "He knows your face. He'll bolt the second you approach him." Cassius looked at her, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his lips. "He doesn't know your face, Maeve. And Wallace has a well-documented weakness for beautiful women." Maeve froze. "No, absolutely not. I am not an undercover agent, and I am definitely not gala material. Look at me, Cassius. I don't fit into those worlds. I don't fit into those dresses." Cassius stepped into her space, his towering frame immediately silencing her protests. He reached out, his knuckles brushing her jawline. "You will be the most breathtaking woman in that room. Leave the dress to me." 4 hours later, Maeve stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the master bedroom, entirely speechless. Fiona Abernathy, a sharp-eyed woman with impeccable taste, had arrived with an army of stylists. They had transformed Maeve. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant, intricate chignon. Her makeup was dramatic, smoky eyes and a deep, velvet red lip. But it was the dress that stole her breath. It was a custom-made emerald green gown, crafted from heavy silk that draped flawlessly over her curves. It featured an off-the-shoulder neckline that displayed her collarbones and the generous swell of her cleavage, while the bodice was corseted, cinching her waist before flowing over her wide hips and thick thighs in a dramatic sweep of fabric. A daring slit rode up her left leg. She didn't look like a woman trying to hide her size. She looked powerful. She looked dangerous. She looked beautiful. The bedroom door clicked open. Cassius stepped in, dressed in a flawless midnight blue tuxedo. He stopped dead in his tracks. His icy grey eyes swept over her, from the diamond drops in her ears to the strappy heels on her feet. The air in the room seemed to evaporate. Cassius swallowed hard, his jaw clenching as a dark, possessive hunger flared in his gaze. He walked slowly toward her, stopping just inches away. He didn't say a word. He just lifted his hand and gently ran his fingertips over the bare skin of her shoulder, causing a shiver to violently rock her body. "If we didn't have a corrupt banker to interrogate tonight," Cassius rasped, his voice dropping an octave, "I would lock this door, tear that dress off you, and spend the next 3 days worshipping every inch of this body." Maeve's heart pounded in her throat, her face flushing hotly at his explicit words. "Cassius, but duty calls," he whispered, pressing a hot, searing kiss to the side of her neck. "Stay close to me tonight. Do not leave my sight." The Solstice Gala was held in the grand ballroom of a historic downtown museum. The room was a sea of crystal chandeliers, flowing champagne, and the city's most dangerous elite masked by expensive couture. Maeve felt the weight of 100 stares as she walked in on Cassius's arm. Usually, she would have withered under the attention, assuming they were mocking her size. But with Cassius glaring down anyone who dared look at her for too long, and the heavy, empowering weight of the emerald silk against her skin, she walked with her head held high. "There he is," Cassius murmured, leaning close to her ear. Garrett Wallace was a slick, silver-haired man, holding court near the ice sculptures. "I'll approach him," Maeve said, her pulse quickening. "I memorized the technical jargon of the trust. If I can engage him in a conversation about offshore crypto routing, he'll reveal his knowledge. I just need to get him to say a specific phrase to record his voice key on this hidden mic." Cassius hesitated, clearly hating the idea of her being more than a foot away from him. 2 minutes, Maeve. If he makes a wrong move, I'll snap his neck in front of the mayor." Maeve nodded, taking a deep breath and smoothing down her dress. She detached herself from Cassius and began to weave through the crowd toward Wallace. The plan worked perfectly. Wallace, arrogant and easily charmed by a beautiful woman, taking an interest in his genius, quickly took the bait. Within 90 seconds, Maeve had subtly guided the conversation to financial encryption, prompting Wallace to proudly recite the exact phrasing of the alphanumeric key she needed, recording it flawlessly on the hidden lapel mic. "You have a sharp mind, my dear," Wallace purred, his eyes roaming uncomfortably over her chest. "Perhaps we could discuss this further in my private suite?" "I think my employer would object," Maeve smiled sweetly, turning on her heel. She needed to find Cassius. She scanned the crowded ballroom, but he was nowhere to be seen. Panic fluttered in her chest. She moved toward the quieter, dimly lit corridors near the museum's rear exhibits, hoping to spot his towering frame. As she rounded a corner near the ancient Egyptian wing, she heard hushed voices echoing from a shadowy alcove. She found the proxy server. "They're going after Wallace tonight." Maeve froze. That was Elias's voice. She pressed her back against the cool marble wall, holding her breath, and peered around the corner. Elias was standing in the shadows, holding a burner phone to his ear. His scarred face was twisted in a scowl. "Yes, Ivanov," Elias hissed into the phone. "I tipped you off about the convoy, didn't I? The hit failed because Cassius shielded the fat bitch. But I have a new opening. Cassius is distracted. If your men breach the loading dock in 5 minutes, you can take him out. I want his territory, Anton, just like we agreed." Maeve clamped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute horror. Elias wasn't just a disgruntled employee. He was the traitor. He was the leak who had been helping David Trent. And now he was selling Cassius out to the Volkovs. She had to warn Cassius, now. She took a step backward, but in her panic, her stiletto heel caught on the heavy hem of her emerald gown. She stumbled, her shoulder slamming hard against a decorative bronze shield mounted on the wall. The metal clanged loudly, echoing down the empty corridor like a gunshot. The hushed voice in the alcove instantly stopped. Maeve didn't wait. She hiked up her heavy silk skirt and bolted down the hallway. "Hey!" Elias shouted from behind her, his heavy footsteps pounding against the marble floor. Maeve ran as fast as she could, her heart tearing out of her chest. But the heels and the heavy gown slowed her down. She reached the end of the corridor, turning toward a set of heavy mahogany doors that led to the service stairwell. She shoved the door open, but before she could slip through, a brutal hand clamped down on her hair, jerking her violently backward. Maeve cried out in pain as she was thrown hard against the stairwell wall. The heavy door swung shut, cutting off the music and light from the gala, plunging them into the dim, cold light of the concrete stairs. Elias stood over her, his eyes wild and murderous, a switchblade gleaming in his hand. "Snooping around, piggy," Elias sneered, stepping closer, the blade catching the dim light. "I told Cassius you were a liability. Now I get to prove it to him by leaving your body for him to find." The cold, fluorescent light of the concrete stairwell bounced off the polished steel of Elias's switchblade. Maeve's back was pressed hard against the unyielding cinderblock wall, her heavy breaths causing the emerald silk of her bodice to heave violently. "You should have stayed under that desk, piggy," Elias snarled, closing the distance between them. His scarred face was twisted in a mixture of triumph and deep-seated hatred. "I've spent 10 years building this empire with Cassius. 10 years of blood and broken bones, and he was going to hand the financial keys to a soft, fat, weak little accountant just because she knows how to read a spreadsheet." "I know how to read you, Elias," Maeve said, her voice shaking, but a spark of defiant fire igniting in her chest. She wasn't the trembling mouse from the office anymore. She had survived a shootout. She had outsmarted a billionaire banker. She refused to die in a dingy stairwell. "Ivanov doesn't respect you. He's using you to get to Cassius. The moment you hand over the territory, the Volkovs will put a bullet in your head." Elias's eyes flashed with furious uncertainty. "Shut up!" He lunged forward, thrusting the blade toward her stomach. Driven by pure, unadulterated survival instinct, Maeve didn't shrink away. She twisted her wide hips, the heavy silk of her skirt snapping through the air as the blade grazed her waist, slicing through the fabric, but missing her skin. In the same fluid motion, she reached down, unclasped the ankle strap of her heavy, pointed stiletto, and swung it upward with all the strength she possessed. The 4-inch solid steel heel caught Elias directly in the temple. A sickening crack echoed in the enclosed space. Elias howled in pain, stumbling backward and dropping the knife as he clutched his profusely bleeding head. Before he could recover, the heavy mahogany doors at the top of the landing were kicked open with the force of a detonating bomb. The solid wood splintered off its hinges, crashing onto the concrete floor. Cassius Mercer stood in the doorway. He didn't look like a man. He looked like a god of war, unleashed from hell. His midnight blue tuxedo jacket was pushed back as both of his hands gripped a suppressed tactical pistol. His icy grey eyes locked onto the scene. Maeve backed against the wall, her dress slashed, holding a bloody shoe, and Elias staggering on the steps. Cassius moved with terrifying lethal speed. He bypassed the stairs entirely, vaulting over the railing and dropping 10 feet to land squarely on the landing next to Elias. "Boss, wait!" Elias pleaded, raising his hands, his face pale with terror. Cassius didn't speak. He holstered his weapon, grabbed Elias by the lapels of his suit, and slammed him face first into the concrete wall. The sickening sound of breaking cartilage filled the air. Cassius spun the traitor around and drove a brutal, punishing fist into Elias's ribs, snapping them like dry twigs. Elias collapsed to his knees, coughing up blood. Cassius picked up the dropped switchblade, his face an emotionless mask of pure, concentrated violence. He grabbed Elias by the hair, yanking his head back to expose his throat. "You tipped off Ivanov," Cassius stated, his voice a low, vibrating hum that chilled Maeve to the bone. "You tried to kill her." He has men breaching the loading dock right now," Elias choked out, desperate to trade information for his life. 40 heavily armed men. You can't beat them, Cassius. The Volkovs have already won. Let me go, and I'll call them off." A dark, terrifying smile curved Cassius's lips. "I don't need you to call them off, Elias. I need them to walk into the trap." Cassius looked up, locking eyes with Maeve. "Cover your ears, my love." Maeve clamped her hands over her ears and squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't want to see it, but she felt the finality of it in the air. A single, muffled thud sounded, followed by the heavy slump of a body hitting the concrete. When she opened her eyes, Elias lay motionless on the floor. Cassius was already moving toward her, wiping the blade on a crisp white handkerchief before tossing it aside. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands frantically roaming over her body, checking the slice in the emerald silk. His large, warm palms smoothed over the curve of her waist, his thumbs tracing her ribcage. "I'm fine," Maeve gasped, dropping her shoe and throwing her arms around his broad shoulders, burying her face in the crook of his neck. "He didn't cut me. I'm okay." Cassius wrapped his arms tightly around her waist, crushing her soft, generous curves against his solid, muscular frame. He buried his face in her hair, breathing her in like oxygen. "I heard him," Cassius murmured, his voice laced with venom. "I heard what he called you. If he wasn't almost already dead, I would kill him 1,000 times over." He pulled back just enough to look deeply into her eyes. "You are magnificent. You fought back." Downstairs, the muffled, staccato pop of heavy gunfire began to echo through the building's foundations. Ivanov's men had breached the loading dock. "We need to leave," Cassius said, his tactical mind snapping back into focus. He scooped her up as if she weighed absolutely nothing. "Cassius, I'm too heavy," Maeve protested, her cheeks burning as he effortlessly settled her in his arms. "Do not ever say that to me again," he growled, kicking the heavy stairwell door open with his foot. "You are exactly the weight I want to carry." They bypassed the gala entirely, slipping through the service corridors to the roof, where a private helicopter was already waiting, its rotors thumping loudly against the Chicago skyline. Below them, police sirens began to wail, mixing with the sound of Cassius's elite security forces, neutralizing the Volkov ambush in the loading dock. The private chopper bypassed the Abernathy penthouse and flew straight to a secure, heavily fortified cliffside compound overlooking Lake Michigan. Cassius's true sanctuary. An hour later, the chaos of the night had faded into a tense, vibrating silence. Maeve sat at the massive steel desk in Cassius's private study. The emerald gown was ruined, slashed at the waist and stained with dust, but she hadn't bothered to change. The adrenaline was still pumping through her veins. Cassius stood behind her, his hands resting heavily on her bare shoulders, his thumbs slowly caressing her collarbones. He had discarded his tuxedo jacket and unbuttoned his shirt, exposing the dark ink of a sprawling tattoo that covered his chest. "Do it," Cassius commanded softly. Maeve brought up the offshore banking terminal on the encrypted laptop. She initiated the transfer protocol. A biometric prompt flashed on the screen in bright red. Voice authentication required. Maeve pressed play on the digital recorder she had hidden in her cleavage at the gala. Garrett Wallace's arrogant, smooth voice filled the quiet room. "The sequence is Alpha Tango Niner 7 Omega. Trust authorization confirmed." The computer whirred for an agonizing second. Then the red prompt turned a brilliant, glowing green. Access granted. Balance: $412,500,000 US. "Transferring to the untraceable Mercer Phantom accounts," Maeve whispered, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She hit the final execution key. The balance on the screen instantly plummeted to 0. Cassius let out a low, predatory laugh. "Ivanov is finished. By tomorrow morning, the Volkov syndicate will be utterly bankrupt. His own lieutenants will turn on him when the payroll bounces. You didn't just save my empire, Maeve. You conquered his." He reached down, closing the laptop with a decisive snap. He gripped the heavy, velvet-upholstered chair she sat in and spun it around so she was facing him. Cassius braced his hands on the armrests, trapping her. His icy grey eyes burned with a fire so intense it made Maeve's breath catch in her throat. The danger of the night, the betrayal, the violence, it all melted away, leaving only the raw, undeniable electricity crackling between them. "The work is done," Cassius whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips. "Cassius," Maeve started, but her voice failed her. He reached out, his long fingers tangling in the messy remnants of her elegant updo, pulling the pins loose until her dark hair fell in a cascade around her bare shoulders. He traced the soft curve of her jaw, his thumb brushing against her lower lip. "All my life I have been surrounded by people trying to take what is mine," Cassius murmured, leaning in until their noses brushed. "Assassins, traitors, rivals. Women who wanted my money, men who wanted my power. But you stepped into my world, looked the devil in the eye, and protected me." He hauled her up out of the chair, his powerful hands gripping her wide hips. He backed her up until she hit the wall of the study, pressing his massive frame flush against hers. The sensation of his hard chest against her soft breasts, his hips pinning hers to the wood paneling. sent a wave of liquid heat straight to her core. "I'm not like the women in your world," Maeve breathed, her hands coming up to rest flat against his bare, tattooed chest, feeling the heavy, rapid thumping of his heart. "I'm not glamorous, Cassius. I don't fit in. I'm too big, too soft, too—" Cassius silenced her with a kiss that was equal parts savage and reverent. He devoured her protests, his tongue sweeping into her mouth, tasting her, claiming her. His hands roamed frantically over her body, memorizing the dip of her waist, the heavy, luscious curve of her thighs beneath the silk, the plush softness of her stomach. When he finally pulled away, they were both gasping for air. "You are a goddess," he rasped, his eyes completely black with obsession. He ground his hips against hers, letting her feel exactly how much she affected him. "Every soft inch of you, every curve. Your brilliant, lethal mind. I don't want a fragile porcelain doll I have to worry about breaking. I want a woman who can crack a global laundering ring and kill a traitor with a stiletto in the same night." He buried his face in her neck, pressing open-mouthed kisses along her pulse point. "You aren't too big for my world, Maeve. You are exactly the size a queen should be to sit on a throne." Maeve felt the last remnants of her lifelong insecurity shatter into dust. The heavy shame she had carried for 28 years evaporated under the heat of his absolute devotion. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was powerful. She tangled her fingers in his dark hair, pulling his head back, matching the fierce, hungry look in his eyes with her own. "Then prove it," she challenged, a wicked smile playing on her lips. Cassius's eyes widened slightly in surprise, before narrowing into a dark, feral smirk. He gripped the torn fabric of the emerald gown, his knuckles white. "Try me," he growled, and as he tore the silk, the ruthless boss of the underworld fell completely to his knees, worshipping the woman who had stolen his empire and his heart. What an explosive finale! Maeve proved that true power comes from owning exactly who you are, curves, brains, and all. Did you expect Elias to be the traitor all along? And how intensely satisfying was it when Cassius finally claimed his queen? If you loved this dark, thrilling mafia romance and want to hear more stories where the brilliant, plus-size heroine gets the ruthless billionaire who worships her, you know what to do. Please like this video, share it with your fellow romance readers, and subscribe to the channel for more addictive audio stories.